All right, so this is the first video in a class that I taught for years, but I updated it recently. This is 2025. It was a world philosophies class, but now I'm calling it the Cultivating Practical Wisdom, Phronesis in Our Time to create a global sustainable civilization. And so I I won't talk about the syllabus or the assignments or anything like that, but I'm going to begin with a summary of the reading list so that anyone who's taking this class will understand my thoughts behind the readings and the order that they're in. And they can go and buy the books if they like. Um, so it's up to them. I have outlines that have quotes from mostly from the assigned parts. So if someone buys the book, they can read the parts that I thought were important. Most of these books you can get used online. They're not very expensive, but they do give you this big picture of our world today and gives you perspective so that you can figure out how to act and most of all, how to live a flourishing life. Aristotle's idea of a flourishing life has been the foundation for my scholarship, for my teaching, but also for my life. Sometimes I lose my mind. I have lost my mind before and been given over to fear, especially, and just not been able to really live a virtuous, just, and wise life. But it's still a good goal, and I have no idea how I could have lived without that goal in the back of my mind throughout the ups and downs of my life. So if other people can pull it off, very good, but especially at this time in the first few weeks, we have some readings to explain why it's hard to keep your mind and why it's important not to lose your mind. Okay, so the list of readings is, let me share that. Um, all right, here's the the order that I'm going to present them. There is a book called Excellent Sheep by a woman named William Dershowitz, and he's talking about college and he's talking about liberal arts, what the traditional view of going to college and developing a liberal mind, what that's about. My professional life has focused not only on Aristotle, but on Plato. My dissertation was on Plato's view of the soul, and I agree with Alfred North Whitehead, who says, the history of Western thought is a footnote to Plato. I'm a fan. So the Phaedo, I think, has 6 different views of the powers of the soul. I think Plato shows that we all have those powers. It's just that each of those powers is examined in terms of what they tell you about the immortality of the soul. This is a dialogue that took place right before Socrates drank the hemlock and died. And I will talk about Socrates in a little while. But basically, we have the ecologist's argument, where you die and your body decomposes and something else grows from that. You have the mathematical mystic argument, where somebody is a mathematician. Sometimes they can be Hindus or Buddhists or atheists or agnostics, or some of them are really conservative Christians. They can be conservative Buddhists or conservative Muslims, or they can be liberal. It's amazing how there's this huge gap between focusing on mathematics and a leap toward whether you think there's any underlying cause to the universe. That's the second one. The third one is the theologian's argument that life is about the struggle between good, seeking truth and justice and eternal life, or choosing the things of the body, right? And so that's a divided soul, but it's a theological argument. Then the fourth argument is what I used to call the Prozac argument. Maybe now it's the opioids argument, but that your soul is basically chemistry, brain chemistry, and all you do is get the right brain chemistry and you're fine, you're good to go. So it's described as the harmony of the liar, the harmony argument, but that's really a brain chemistry argument. And then the last one is the biologist's argument. The soul is the principle of life, the life force. And then the argument that I think is Plato's argument is called the argument from mind, or nous. And this course is about cultivating practical wisdom in the world today. And the word practical wisdom, phronesis, comes from the root of nous. And so both Aristotle and Plato thought the life of the mind is the good life, is the flourishing life. And the most important object for your mind is to understand that the universe is ordered, and therefore we can understand it. We disagree on how to describe that order, but there is an order there. The very fact that we're looking for it, that we disagree, and then we can self-correct, and we have rejected some views and taken on other views. We couldn't possibly do that and make any progress unless there actually is an order out there against which we are testing our theories, developing and testing them. And then there's an order to human affairs. There's an underlying basic instinctual drives that we have that will never end. So there's an order to how we experience those drives, how societies enculturate for those drives. And the point of wisdom is always to try and do the best in a given situation. And the best is always what encourages flourishing. My flourishing, everybody else's flourishing, and the flourishing of the natural world. So integrity, integrating yourself, your emotions, your actions, your thoughts, your way of life with other people, creating a culture, and then linking culture to nature. This is the goal. So what Mr. Dershowitz is talking about is the first step, which is you come to college with having lived in a bubble. Haven't been widely exposed to a lot of different ideas or ways of life or experiences, and you have to examine. You have to go from living an unexamined life to living an examined life. So next time I'll talk more about that. Also, next time I'll talk about the fact that the research, at least this research result, was that especially first and second year students who come to college, especially a liberal arts college, are 25 to 30% more likely as adults to take on leadership positions in their communities, to read, to stay abreast of what's going on, to be informed, and to engage with cultural life where they live, and to live more satisfying lives also, and successful. But they're also a high quality of life. They contribute to the community. They're not just measured, people don't just measure themselves by their financial or political success. All right, and I will expand on that next time. The next one, so that's the goal, is flourishing. And the next lecture is about the 7 ages of globalization, that we are in the 4th industrial revolution, that we are in a time of disruption. So always before, these changes occurred because of some new invention that led to a new economic system that disrupted everything that went before. So we are in a time of disruption. We will have technological disruption. The digital age is digital disruption, environmental disruption, geopolitical disruption, and demographic disruption. People will move to the cities. So what I want to tell my students is you will grow up and you will lead in a time of great disruption. And don't be surprised by it. And don't overreact. And don't be afraid. Because if you're educated, if you're college educated, and you have a liberal mind, you will be able to lead. You will be able to explain to people. Don't try to find someone to blame. We just happen to live at this time in history. Nobody is to blame for this. But the more we figure out how to adapt, and the more we figure out how to flourish in this 4th industrial revolution, the better off we will be, everybody we know. And this particular revolution, we have to integrate culture with nature. So your generation, we have a huge project, but you should look at it as a challenge, as something to inspire you. And everything you do that works really contributes or prevents things from getting worse, which they could easily do. Okay, the next reading is about globalization and what happened. I remember in 1996, Clinton was reelected, and the whole idea in the Clinton era was that the economy will expand all over the world, but we will lift people up from the lower class to the middle class. And then our job as Americans is to work with political leaders so they will create laws that will redistribute that wealth so that the poor will really honestly move into the middle class, and also that the globalization will be sustainable. That did not work. It was mismanaged. So Mr. Stieglitz talks about that. The next one is about systems thinking. So Mr. Capra is claiming that we need to think about nature, culture, the relationship between them as a system. We gave this up in the Enlightenment, and we need to get back to it, or we need to create a new way of understanding it that incorporates the wisdom from the past with the knowledge we've gotten since then, and create a new model for human nature, for culture, and for flourishing. So the first reading from that book is just about a short explanation of where he's going, and then this description of what Enlightenment thinking was like. And we've got to get out of those paradigms where America in particular is still stuck in the Enlightenment paradigms. And that's why we're driving ourselves into the ground. That's why we keep leaving the Paris Accord. It explains a lot of behavior once you just know the background. So I think that's important. Then we have a class on Aristotle's view of virtue, and I call it spiritual humanism, because the Greek idea of spirit, daimon, is living for the sake of something greater than yourself. That could be justice, truth, beauty, wilderness protection. There are 12 Greek deities. Each one of them represents a sacred passion that every one of us can be passionate about those things, but each one of us will probably get most obsessed about one of them, or at different times in our lives, we will focus on maybe two or three. But they're all there, and human beings are living out these passions at all times. So as human beings, we have to compromise. We have to balance these. The gods, each of the gods are totally obsessed, but we're not gods, we're humans. So we have to compromise and cooperate. Okay, the next section of the class is about the corruption of the global economic system. And it would, because of that, Enlightenment thinking and the mistakes in the Enlightenment thinking, the weaknesses, the problems, the two main pillars that have been the problems were that Francis Bacon rejected Aristotle's view that we are the creature that can understand in a universe that's understandable, and our main task to be wise is to figure out our place in that universe and how to flourish without hubris, pride, without overstepping our boundaries. Now, we can expand those boundaries, but at a certain point, we can't. We're not God, and we cannot control nature. Now, Francis Bacon totally rejected that. He said the entire purpose for modern scientific thinking is to understand nature, to gain knowledge in order to exploit it for human well-being. All right, it's very important that that was your mission. That was what God wants you to do. And it had no limits, right? Now, what are we doing? We're destroying the earth. And we've got to give up on that ideology. That worldview is not science. That's an ideology. That's a set of values. That's culture. Culture is different from science, but all science is linked to some worldview, some culture. There's a culture that drives our science. And that was one pillar. And the second one was that the human psyche is a blank slate. And we can construct social engineering. We can engineer human beings. We can take that psyche, like silly putty, and develop systems of behavior modification so that everyone will turn out virtuous. That's when people started talking about utopias, right? So that has not worked because we have not been able to eliminate those deep primitive drives, pleasure and fear, closest to the brainstem. We are not blank slates. And so at the moment, all we have are these very sophisticated techniques of behavior modification being driven by capitalist greed and the military drive for power. So we have behavior modification that triggers our fantasies and our phobias, and it's completely out of bounds. So the next few books that we read, lectures, are about that. What has happened? And America is sort of the cornerstone because we're the most extreme. But we are exporting all of this abroad, which is a big problem. So that's what Mr. Stiglitz in Globalization says, is that the Washington consensus, we just pushed our worldview onto developing countries, and it's been a disaster for them, and they're beginning to fight back. So anyway, the hacking of the American mind is about sugar, and in general about commercial products that trigger the dopamine system in the brain, which is pleasure, immediate pleasure, okay? And when you have an immediate pleasure, it goes down. So whatever it is you do for a dopamine high, you're basically addicted. And so there are limbic capitalism, it's called, all this money made on, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, but mostly sugar. He says sugar is the other white powder, and it's by far the most harmful because everybody does it. So the first half of the book documents the whole sugar thing and the systems in your brain, the body chemistry, and the fact that 80% of Americans over age 50, as of 2020 something, when this book was published, or recently, I think, 80% have a metabolic disorder, and that is mostly due to sugar consumption. And then the second half of the book is about the US economic system and the political system, so that the corporations donate to political campaigns as much as they want since 2010. And whoever has the most money wins the election. And the corporations just treat them like they're employees. So you make those laws, don't make those laws. And the entire cultural system, it has no limits on allowing capitalists to destroy our natural body chemistry and make Americans addicted to dopamine highs, okay? The next one, the anxious generation, is about social media, which does exactly the same thing. So the writer of that, Jonathan Haidt, is very upset, and his claim is that Facebook, social media causes mental illness in teenagers. It causes boys to get on video games and not to launch. Failure to launch means they can't go out there and be independent. And for girls, it causes depression. So what the punchline there is a quote from the Facebook executive who says, "This is a business. We are competing for your attention. And in order to get your attention, we have to go deeper and deeper into the brain stem." Okay, like there's no beating around the bush. They are literally trying to make you mentally unstable so that you will obsess about your social media, and they will make a lot of money. And they don't apologize. Like, this is the American dream. This is success, to get super, super rich. And it has nothing to do with teaching citizens in a democratic society how to think like citizens, how to act rationally, how not to overreact, right? Wow. So at a time in history when there are going to be all of these other big disruptions, corporations are making tons of money, completely disrupting our digestive system and our social life system. It is a really horrible combination, which is why I read these books during COVID or since COVID, and I decided my students need to know this because they're being exploited and they have to go out into the world and run it in the next 20 years. And it is going to blow up, but they've already blown up their brains and their bodies. So I want them to think about this. It's really important to me, and I hope it's just as important to them. The next one is about polarization. So, not surprisingly, um, uh, when people get unstable like that, there is power-hungry people run for office in democracies, or they get themselves put into power. So they either get elected or they get placed into positions of power because people are unstable. So the next three excerpts from those three books are about how democracies die. And it is, a lot of it is because of this growing gap between the rich and the poor, the failure of globalization to live up to its promise of creating a stable middle class, the failure of the Enlightenment, the rise of corporations, the exploitation for money of the human psyche, and also polarizing human opinion, the algorithms on YouTube or wherever people get their information, and the way it just keeps reinforcing the same opinions. So all of this is leading to animosity between citizens, and that leads to instability, and that leads to the rise of a very power-hungry person who can get themselves put into power, and all they do with it is help their friends and harm their enemies. They don't fix people's problems. They try to make people feel more secure, but they don't do anything that actually makes them more secure. Okay, so I think my students need to know that. The next book is Strongman, and it gives you analogies between different, so each chapter has some similarities among these different strongmen. So one of them is Berlusconi in Italy. There's Gaddafi in Libya. There's, I think Mussolini. Anyway, she has about 5 of them. And each chapter describes what they did to fit in with this pattern. So again, and she does refer to Donald Trump as a strongman, but I tell my students, because I say, you don't have to agree with her, okay? She is a scholar, so you have to listen to her. Most of my students voted for Trump, or their parents did. So it's important for me to respect them, but I do tell them back in that first reading, my job is to get you to rethink everything. Some of the things your parents told you are good, and some you'd want to reconsider. So the idea there is that your mother made you eat vegetables and it made you mad. Now you come to college, you don't ever have to eat a vegetable the whole time you're here. But you read about vegetables and you find out, oh, my mother was right. So now you eat your vegetables, but not because your mother said so. You did it because you've done the research and you want to live by the power of your mind, the truth about what your body needs. Well, there's other things your parents said, which you're going to have to re-examine everything. What did they say that really is according to reason? But now you do it because it's reasonable. What did they tell you that really wasn't based on reason? So then you have to figure out, was there anything in what my parents said that was reasonable or not? And then you just parse it out. But you have to comb it all through, re-examine it. So an examined life is where everything you do or think has been filtered through the light of the mind, your reason, and you're living on the basis of the light of the mind. Okay, then we have a paper on democracy. What do they think it is? Do they think it's a problem? Right? The next one is an article about the US founding fathers and that they really, one of their main missions was to educate the public, to try and create a system of public education. Now, I teach at a small liberal arts college. The early on, the first century of the US, many people came out and established these small liberal arts schools. The idea was that the best and the brightest, the people with privilege, natural ability, motivation, would get this education which unifies reason and faith. And it also creates, it's based on a set of virtues. It could be Aristotle's virtues, but our founding fathers really liked Confucius Analects, and they wanted people to separate what they believe in church from the kind of virtue they have to exercise as citizens. Now, the church that I went to, certain churches, what you learn in church is perfectly consistent with the same way of life you want to exercise in the public arena. But our founders allowed in a lot of religious sects or denominations that split reason from faith and that had beliefs that they should never bring into the public arena. For example, my relatives on my dad's side were Swedish Baptists. They came to America because they didn't want those Lutherans to baptize their babies or to make them baptize their babies. They did not want their babies baptized. So they came here. Well, the Catholics must have thought those people were horrible because these babies were dying and children were dying that had not been baptized. If you're Catholic, you think, they're never going to be able to go to heaven. They'll end up in limbo. And if you're some other denomination, you might think, well, anyway, they're not going to end up in a good place, right? So they must despise those people, but not when they're in the town hall meeting. When you're in the town hall meeting, when you have to work together to harvest the crops, when you have to, elect leaders and make laws and apply laws, leave that at church. Here, you're a humanist. Here, you compromise. You figure out how to work together to flourish. So we read about that. Then we read about how Americans, especially recently, have been miseducated. So in other words, we have uneducated voters. And the particular case I use is a whole tradition where Nobel Prize physicists who helped create the bomb in the Manhattan Project were paranoid about any intervention between the government and and the private sector because of Russia, right? But so not even incentives and disincentives. They didn't want anything. So they worked with professional advertisers to sell like a commercial product, doubt. Doubt is your product that you sell. First, there was doubt about whether cigarettes caused cancer because you wouldn't want any government intervention. Then whether secondhand smoke caused cancer. Then whether the ozone layer was a problem. Then whether acid rain was a problem. Deny, 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 until you can't deny anymore. So the recent one has been climate change. And there's just been this incredible campaign to sell doubt. And America is still brainwashed. They're completely propagandized. Most of my students think climate change hasn't been proven. So we have to at least look at that and say, look, the scientists agree on this a long time ago, but the public was sold doubt. You need to consider whether the people you know have bought the doubt and they're wrong. You just have to know that because the stakes are high. All right, then, how do we bring about a sustainable civilization? The next reading by David Orr. How do you educate children to love life? They got to go outside and play, not be on their phones, right? They have to get attached to the natural world. They have to care about animals. And children naturally do. It's just that we've created a culture where they're hooked on sugar, they're hooked on their phones. I mean, it's just crazy. It's so obviously unnatural. So children need to learn biophilia. Well, the next book is about how children in China are taught STEM, and they, right from junior high, they sit down in the chair at 6 a.m. and study until 10 p.m., 6 days a week or something. So again, that's not biophilia. That's not developing a feel for organisms or anything. That particular kind of boot camp is now directed toward green energy and green technology, thank goodness. So it might save us in the end. But the education system itself is not going to help us with culture. Now, the Chinese have this culture of Taoism, Confucianism, haiku, where people do get connected to nature, but I don't know if that's falling apart or if it's being preserved. It's possible, right, to create this really integrated culture. But so I make the students think about that. Then the next book is about the backgrounds for Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg. It has a chapter on Elon Musk, but I don't think I assigned it. But her big thing, she's a specialist. She was the reporter that got in on the dot-com event emergence and reported on it over the years. So her book is about that. She had originally, they were going to save the world. They were going to be progressive. We were going to have this wonderful stuff, connecting with other people, integrating culture and nature because we would have all the data. That's what I thought, the internet would do. Yeah, okay. And then she gradually says, no, no, they're just as greedy as everybody else, and all they care about is money. And she's pretty disgusted. And I just saw a YouTube. I just noticed a YouTube where she's talking about that because I'm doing this right after Donald Trump has just gotten inaugurated the second time. And so Elon Musk is big. It looks like he's going to be running the government. Trump has him everywhere. But Zuckerberg, Bezos, they all donated $1 million to the inauguration, so everybody's on board. Anything for a buck. So that's important for the students to know. Then a book by Jeffrey Sachs that was written right after the collapse of 2007. And he talks about culture, and he talks about American culture has been infected by capitalism, and people need to learn mindfulness training. They need to, Sachs really likes both Aristotle and Confucius, and he also likes the wisdom literature, so he talks about that. So there's two parts to that book I picked. First of all, the problems with our culture. We have a lot of money, but income inequality, number of hours staring at phones or TV, diet and exercise, but also mental health. We just have incredible problems considering how much overall wealth we have because we don't distribute it because of capitalism. So that's number one is how it's structured, and the second one is, well, how do we do this by becoming more mindful? We have to change ourselves spiritually, internally, and then we can start changing all the things around us. So then the second paper is about education. So I asked the students to envision the kind of education they think we should have moving forward. So the first paper was to envision how they want our democracy to be preserved moving forward or recreated, however you want to call it. How do we revive our democracy? Okay, so then the next section of the class, we talk more about systems thinking. And Mr. Capra talks about nature as a system, and then culture emerged from that, and it needs to integrate. We need ecological literacy. And so he thinks of social systems. So we have a chapter on how social systems are systems. The mechanistic worldview treats social systems like machines. The economic model is you have this machine and you have a manager, and he's beholden to stockholders, and people are just organizational management or something. But organizations are not machines. They're organisms. People interact with each other. They're connected to a way of life. So a social system should be dedicated to overall human flourishing, well-being, integrity. And then the healthcare system, it's broken because it treats people, again, like just physical beings, like a disease must have a physical cause, and you can give people a pill and it will cure it. This is not true. Many of our health problems are culturally related, caused by the fact that most people can't afford healthy food, the fact that they work so much they can't exercise, or they don't have access to either physical spaces or fitness centers. They can't pay for it. They don't have any way to exercise. And then the mental health care system is caused by stress or breakdowns in relationships, or just a culture where people don't cultivate relationships. They don't develop them, maintain them. Families are separated from each other. The breadwinner is sent here and there and everywhere, separated from extended family, has to work is gone half the week. I mean, all these things are complete breakdowns in culture, and the healthcare system tries to cure you with a pill. So he's talking about that. Then the next thing is ecology, ecological literacy, ecological thinking, and the traditional idea of spirituality, which is just integrity. And he says if we just think of spirituality that way, we need to return to a spirituality is perfectly consistent with systems thinking. Okay, and then the other thing that I think is interesting, and this is also Aristotle. So Mr. Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, he has a chapter on spirituality. He says, I'm actually an atheist, but I'm come to realize that psychologically, religious communities provide people with what they need. They need to sacrifice for the sake of some higher good. They need to come together uh, and bind together in dedicating themselves to a higher good. They need to have fellowship together. They need to have rituals. Okay, and so he says, you don't have to literally believe in some God somewhere. You have to know that these kind of communities are really important. That's what our founding fathers thought, right? The virtues of Confucius. In the public realm, you come together. It should be a sacred community of citizens governing themselves. That should be considered sacred. Um, Without some, divine, supernatural, powerful God intervening or getting in the way. And then Mr. Lutzig, who made the hacking about the problem with sugar, he says again, we need spirituality. We need all those traditions, rituals, people coming together, having fellowship. You go to church and then you go downstairs and have fellowship hall, and the ritual is dedicating yourself once more to something greater than yourself. So they're all coming back to it. The thing from my point of view is that they also have a chapter on Aristotle's idea of flourishing. So that's definitely coming back. And just like our founders, the Greek view of flourishing was linked with um, democracy and any sort of version of humanistic version of the religious traditions. And if the religious traditions are anti-humanist, keep them out of the public realm. All right, then the last book that we read is called Ethics in Action for Sustainable Development. And this is really where I'd like to take my career, at least part of it, from now on, because around 2015, the United Nations came out with its Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Accord was signed, and Pope Francis came out with Laudato Si, which is his encyclical that demands that Christians, but people of any religious tradition and of any humanist tradition, have to come together to create a sustainable future. So those things happened, and then Jeffrey Sachs and the Pope convened a working group of some of the most respected representatives from many, many different religious traditions, many branches of a tradition, and some secular humanists, some Confucian, Taoist, natural sort of worldviews, and some others that really weren't even affiliated, didn't have any label at all. But they came together and each one wrote an essay on their tradition's values and their tradition's idea of the common good. And it became clear that all of these can be united to support the Sustainable Development Goals. So they aren't just sustainability, they're also poverty, indigenous knowledge. There's 17 of them, so there's calling out businesses, calling out corruption. They're not naive. They really know how far we are from this goal. But if we don't become sustainable, we all die. So the stakes are high. Nobody can tell me, oh, people aren't like that. people don't want to die either. And so it's the moment where people really could be motivated to come together. They might be motivated by self-preservation. They might be motivated by greed. They could make money selling a green product or working for a green company. But at the end of the day, people need to have a set of values, a culture that affirms these values. And so the reason why this working group is important is because it doesn't split science from religion. And it gets religious leaders in all these traditions to lead their people, right? They have access to people. The scientists have become so specialized, they're often very separated from most people. They're just a small little group preaching, the truth. Well, it's not very helpful. Religious leaders can get on board. They can preach. They can teach at their schools. There are all these religious schools. Those schools can be designed around sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals. There's just a way that if you have the religious traditions on board, you can really disseminate culture. You can really make some headway. And my career, I have worked on religious pluralism and Greek humanism. And I would really like to move forward with teaching, educating the next generation of people who are now mid-career, and also young people, students in their future. So we really can come to a consensus. We can have a common conversation. The Enlightenment philosophy is the only discipline that has no idea what the discipline is. And there's been so many serious disagreements, partly since the Enlightenment. And there's so much fragmentation and polarization within the discipline of philosophy, between philosophy and the other disciplines, and between philosophers and any group of the public. I really think it's got to stop because we need to move forward into a sustainable civilization, not just an engineering project, a civilization. All right. So the first assignment just is the introduction about the project. Then the virtue ethic across all these traditions, and a secular ethic that has the same basic values, and then a model for an economic system that is also humanistic, not the mechanical system that we have. Then a chapter on, or a few chapters where people from some of the traditions talk about their notion of the common good and the world's virtue traditions. So each of them talk about these things, and you can recognize that they have a common idea. Then I do a little section on Confucius, and I also point out that our founding fathers liked Confucius, and Mr. Xi Jinping right now, he also is referring to Confucius as he goes about creating his sustainable future, which is his ultimate goal, which is not ultimate. I mean, he's achieving it at an incredible pace. They have a goal for when they'd stop using unrenewable sources of energy, and they're ahead of their goal. But anyway, the idea that we think the US and China is so different, but when it comes to these basic virtues, it's not. It just has a different view of how to combine a private sector market with government regulation, right? So the Chinese have a highly regulated, they lend money, they give loans to private sectors, to engage in research and development of green products. And I assume other things. I read about the green products because I'm so excited about it. But the US has a much more hands-off view. But not only that, now the capitalists basically run our government, and our government is weaker and weaker in its ability to guide, to provide incentives or disincentives, or to punish, to create laws which tell corporations they cannot do it and they'll pay a price if they do. We don't, our political sector is very weak. And their Chinese political sector is very strong. And so it matters. So the free market behaves in very different ways. And I think our founders would be very worried about how much greed is controlling our culture, because Aristotle thought greed was the political evil, the number one vice that destroys human communities. And at this point in history, it's also destroying life on Earth. So it's a problem. Then there's a chapter on ending poverty. Now, that might sound like idealistic, but if you read about the income inequality and how severe it is, if the richest, I don't know, what did he say, 1,700 people gave 1% of their wealth, you would be able to educate every child in the world. That's how severe it is. It's not utopia. It's just what we live in right now is a dysutopia, and we need to be aware of it and not make it, not normalize it, not accept it as normal. It's not. Then the next few chapters are about peace and education, setting up an educational system. What are the barriers? Where should we go from here? Then they have paper number 3 is about how do you think we should link religion, science, and sustainability and virtue? How do you think we should? Each student really has to put it together in their own way. They have to create, because they have to create a vision of a worldview they can carry with them during this era of disruption. Then, after that, the last little bit is about business, investing, and corruption, and the future of work. And then finally, their conclusion was to create a modern virtue ethic. So you take those old virtues, but you apply them, you incorporate all the new knowledge, and come up with a global sustainable civilization. So then, in the last class, we go back to those same readings we started with. What is college for? Well, has the class actually led you to re-examine everything you learned and form a worldview that you can take with you in the next generation? You know, you've learned things from people who've lived in the past or what will soon be the past, and you have to envision the future. And then evidence of liberal arts. Do you plan to participate? Do you plan to take on leadership roles? So, and then the final paper is, how do you plan? What's your overall big picture? So that is the organization of the class. You know, you could just listen to this podcast and forget it. Not bother with the rest of them. You know, the rest of them are just footnotes to that. But all right, so I think that is the first lecture, and I will leave it at that.